You're watching BBC News. I'm Lauren Taylor. Well, let's focus now on a breaking story in space. Within the next half hour, Japan hopes to become just the 5th country in the world to achieve a moon landing. Its SLIM mission, which stands for Smart Lander for Investigating the Moon, will aim for a gentle descent close to a crater called Scioli. The attempt follows the failure this month of a private American company to reach the lunar surface, and it has proven hard to land on the moon safely. Only about half of all attempts have succeeded. Let's cross to the newsroom and our science correspondent Jonathan Amos. So tell us what's special about this one.
Well, the whole point of this mission is to test precise navigation technologies. That's one of the key points of this mission. As you've correctly said there, it's difficult to land on the moon. Depending on how you count it, only about 4 out of the last 9 or 10 missions that have tried to soft land on the moon have succeeded. You know, it's an airless body. It's not as big as the Earth, but it's big enough to have a decent amount of gravity to pull you in. So you can't use parachutes, but you do have to try and slow yourself down. And that means using rockets as you come in, and then using some sort of technology to know where the surface is so that you can guide those engines, switch them off at the appropriate moment, not too early, and gently put yourself down on the surface while at the same time avoiding big rocks. So it is not easy, and we've seen a number of efforts in recent years fail to do that. But hopefully Japan, with this new technology that it has on board, it's using a sort of crater mapping technique. So it'll take pictures of the moon surface as it comes in. It'll compare those pictures with the onboard maps that it has, just to do very, very fast image processing to work out where it is in space and then get itself to the surface. And it's hoping to touch down at the Scioli crater within about 100 meters, so a football field or so, of the location that they have targeted. And if they achieve that, then they will become only the 5th nation to have successfully soft landed on the moon.
And recently Japan had a few problems, hadn't they, with their rocket technology. How is this one going to be different?
Well, you're referring to their new rocket, the big rocket that they get themselves, or their missions off Earth, introducing a new version of that, and that's had teething problems. But they'll sort those out in time. Mitsubishi that makes a lot of this space technology and has also made this lander. You know, they have a reputation for getting on top of the technical issues. So we would hope in time that big rocket will work, because that's important for the Japanese Space Agency, JAXA, going forward to launch all sorts of missions. You know, in due course, they also want to try and land on the moons of Mars as well, which will be quite extraordinary. Nobody's ever done that. Japan also, you know, they've landed twice on asteroids, which is incredible. You know, the Americans have only done that kind of once, to soft land and pick a sample up and bring it back to Earth. Landing on an asteroid, more easy. It's easier than landing on a body like Mars because of the gravity involved. But you know, Japan are really up there with their technology, really up there.
And you mentioned earlier that they were attempting to land kind of within about 100 meters of the target. Explain to us how that compares with, you know, previous scales of attempted landings and the kind of the range of distance that people would normally expect.
Well, if you go back to the Apollo era, they had supercomputers on board, right? The human brain. So famously, Neil Armstrong, when he brought down Apollo 11 gently onto the surface, he kind of took the stick and said, right, I'm going to do this. And he managed to avoid some very dangerous craters and put the craft, the lunar module, right on the surface where it needed to go. But for robotic missions, yes, you're normally talking about hundreds of meters, if not kilometers, in terms of the precision that they're able to achieve. So getting to within 100 meters will be something of a step change. And that's really important, because if you think, you know, there's somewhere that you want to study on the moon, let's say, you really want to get to as close to that location as you possibly can, because if you don't, you've then got to traverse the moon surface to get to that point, you know, either with rovers or if you've got people, for example, you know, they've got to get out and walk or they've got to have some sort of vehicle to drive there. So we would really like to develop successful, reliable, pinpoint navigation systems at the moon. And of course, we don't have GPS at the moon, not yet. They are working on that, both in the United States and in Europe. They are developing systems that will hopefully have a sort of lunar GPS type system, which will help enormously. But at the moment, one of the best routes is to use this crater mapping, a bit like facial recognition. You know, you have an onboard map, you know in great detail where all the craters are on the moon. The question then is, can you take the pictures and image process those pictures, compare with the map, then send the signals to your thrusters to react in a way that will get you to where you want to be? Can you do that in the time available before you hit the surface or hit a large rock or go into a crater? That's the key test that Japan is going to look for today.
That certainly sounds tricky. Thank you very much for the time being, Jonathan Amos. I'm just joined now by Dr. Emma Gatti, who's editor-in-chief of the online publication Space Watch Global and a former NASA scientist. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. Tell us what's really significant about this Japanese attempt to land on the moon.
Hi, Lorraine. Thank you very much. Well, first, I think Jonathan Amos was very right. Like the attempt that they're trying to accurately and precise landing only 100 meters from the target, that's unprecedented because if you consider that usually we land a few kilometers, the Apollo 11 landed, I think, 6.5 kilometers from the target, which is a bit like if you want to land in Buckingham Palace and you arrive in Brixton, something like this. So downgrading and going to 100 meters from the target is extremely difficult. So this is very important. Itself, the fact that a country like Japan, much smaller than the US or China, could be the fifth nation to join in the big four to arrive on the moon, to land soft on the moon, is extremely interesting. It's historical. If it happens today, it's historical.
Tell us about the size of it and then what happens once it lands.
Well, the payload, they're trying to, this is actually another of their goal. They're trying to keep the payload, the rover, as small as possible. So they want to also to demonstrate how can downsize all the tools, all the equipments to flight as light as possible. Because of course in space, every gram count, every gram matters. So they're trying to send a very small tool, a very small equipment and see how much they can do there with such a small equipment. So it's also important to mention that this is a very small mission in a sort of way. What they're going to try to do once they arrive on the moon is prove that they can land, which is already a huge milestone, prove that they can land as close as possible from the target. And I think they also want to do some scientific testing because they're interested in testing new equipment to find water under the moon surface.
Yeah, so it's interesting. While we're talking to you, we're seeing these images of the little, I'm not quite sure how you would describe it. I suppose it's the little, you tell me, how would you describe that thing?
We call it rover, we call it payload, we call it spaceship if you want. Spaceship is maybe a bit too big for this because it's not as big as the spaceship for the Apollo because it's not carrying any humans, so maybe we can call it.
And so, I mean, what are the risks with the thing? It's quite small, isn't it? What are the risks with this going wrong? What kind of things are they looking out for, trying to prevent?
So landing on the moon is extremely difficult because otherwise we will have done it more often. Anything can go wrong because having a soft landing is extremely complicated because everything has to be extremely accurate. Historically, problems with the software, problems with the navigation, problems with the speed, all those little details. If you look at what happened with Peregrine just a few weeks ago, that was a valve. A very small valve that didn't close well enough, and that was it, end of the mission. So when it comes to landing, usually sensors and softwares, lack of communication, something that tilts in the electric part.
Dr. Emma Gatti, just stay there with us for a minute, because I think we can listen in now to the live feed that is coming into us. Let's just have a listen in.
So first it approaches to the targeted position, and then the vertical descent. And it will have 3 hoverings. and it will try to detect any boulders. And then when it approaches to the slope and have two-step descent and landing.
で着陸は実は短時間で確認できますが、このピンポイント着陸の成否は着陸後1ヶ月以内を見込んでいると。
So
it was interesting that what they were talking about there, that what you were describing as really needing that soft landing is the key, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
So tell us a little bit about the, what's at stake here and why this is so important for a nation to try and do this.
Absolutely. So this is a very important question because sometimes the debate gets a bit lost in these technical details, and the perception of the public is that we are just trying to play with very expensive tools, landing for the sake of landing. There are two important stakes here. One is a political stake. Japan can become the fifth nation landing on the moon after the US, after China, after Russia, China, and India. These four countries are big countries. So this will be the first medium-sized country that can do that. If you think that Japan is, I think, in terms of population, more or less twice as the UK, no other single European country has been able to do that. This exemplifies what it means to invest in space for enough time that then you can actually have ripe your results. Second thing is a technological achievement, because in the moment when you can do something so complicated, it means that all your industry is mature enough to tackle extremely complex technological challenges. And as we all know, what comes from space can be turned into technology that can be applied to military, to defense, to everyday technologies, to support for our local industries. So you have to think that when a country can land on the moon, is saying, I am good enough to play with the big ones. So this is why it's historical, this one. And it's historical because Japan is doing it, which is not as big as China, for example.
Dr. Emma Gatti, thank you very much indeed. And just a reminder, if you're just joining us, so we're watching the Japan attempt to land on the moon. They're trying to land a smart lander for investigating the moon, which is due to land in a precision landing within 100 meters of the area. And as our guest was saying, technological achievement is key here, but also this is a political issue of importance for Japan. You're watching BBC News. Now let's speak to our Asia-Pacific editor, Michael Bristow, who's been monitoring this for us. So we were just talking there about what's at stake politically for Japan. Talk us through how significant it is for a country like Japan.
Yeah, just listening to your previous guest there, talking about particularly China, and I think that's a really important thing. It's issues down on here on Earth, which is driving Japan's space program. Japan has set itself up to some extent to be a rival in East Asia and beyond to China. And China itself has got its own massive space program. It's got an international space station, wants to land men on the moon. And so Japan really sees itself, if it wants to compete with China, it has to do something similar. So really it's considerations down here on Earth which are driving this space exploration as much as any technological advancement, and so that's why what's fueling what Japan does. Essentially, it sees China as a bit of a rival, and as you previous guest also mentioned, there are a lot of space technology that can be used for military purposes as well. So Japan doesn't want to be seen as lagging behind its near neighbour.
And just on that, I mean, you talked about the issue with China. Spell out for us what that would mean if Japan could say, you know, we've landed on the moon and we've got this kind of technology.
Well, first of all, there's prestige. There's prestige because Japan would be just the fifth nation to do such a thing, and so of course it would. Other countries would look up to it, see its technology was working properly. Japan sees itself in the future as being able to launch satellites on behalf of other nations, so it can perfect technology. It will attract business that way, so it will not only just be prestige, it will be for business opportunities as well. As I say, within East Asia, particularly, Japan has set itself up as a rival to China and an alternative power source, someone where other countries can come to help them out as a source of investment and help and technological assistance. So that's what it would mean in terms of Japan, as I say, prestige, commercial help, and perhaps furthering its goal as rivaling China in East Asia.
And in terms of what they've achieved so far, I mean, we heard earlier that they had already landed on small asteroids. How big a leap is it to then getting to the moon?
Yeah, this is, as your previous guest mentioned, it's a really technologically difficult thing to do, and Japan over the last couple of years has had a couple of problems. Just last year it tried to launch a rocket, its flagship rocket. It was hoping that this would be a major technological development that had to be destroyed shortly after takeoff. There was another attempt by a private Japanese company last year to have a soft landing on the moon. That failed as well. So there have been some failures for Japanese space technology over the last year or so. So if they were to succeed in this particular moon landing, then that will be a major advance, seen as a major difficulty considering all those setbacks over the last few years.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Now, before we rejoin Dr. Emma Gatti, I just want to draw your attention to what we're seeing in the box. There's the feed that we're getting from Japan, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, on its SLIM lander, which is a smart lander for investigating the moon. It's known as SLIM, I should say. Let's bring Dr. Emma Gatti back in. Just remind us, for people who might be just joining this now and wanting to see this happen, tell us about what exactly is going to happen when it gets there.
But the SLIM lander has as a first goal, they want to demonstrate it can land. The second goal is that it can land accurately and precisely within 100 meters from the target. So I will keep my eyes exactly on what JAXA is the Japanese Space Agency, is going to tell us about the distance, because this is one of the first milestones that they want to prove. And then they want to prove the fact that they can downsize. They want to send a lander that is as light as possible. And then the third thing, they want to prove that the tools that send in, they're actually useful for doing some scientific studies. In particular, I think they're going to focus on testing some new instrument to find water under the surface of the moon. One of the first things they're going to test, though, is this new visual-based navigation. Is something that also the previous guest was mentioning, the fact that they want to use a combination of camera from the lander and all the high-resolution images from the moon to understand where they're landing. For all them in previously acquired, not all from the 60s. And this is also interesting, Lauren, because often we get criticized about the fact that we took all these pretty pictures of the moon. Why we're spending all this money to take pictures of the moon? Actually, high-resolution images from space can really help navigation and landing, not only on the moon, but also on Earth.
You mentioned in passing there, one of the goals is to find water. Why is it so important for them to find water? Is that because in the long run people want to be able to set up bases where they could sustain human life, or is it to do with discovering more about the moon and how it works?
Both. Scientifically speaking, we're interested in understanding if there is water, because it's one of the fundamental molecules for life. So we want to understand if there is water and how much water there is. The first reason is also true. We are trying to establish a permanent base on the moon. And if we want to go on the moon, we need to understand if we can obtain water. Water is a liquid, is extremely heavy to be shipped from Earth. So anything that can be found on the moon, it will be just a plus. But let me just be very clear on this. Whatever we're going to find on the moon in terms of water is not going to be the same amount of water that we are aware that we are used to on Earth. We're speaking about an extremely dry satellite body of rock. It does not have the same amount of liquid water that we are used to.
Dr. Emma Gatti, do stay with us for the moment. Let's have a quick listen in now to the feed coming from Japan's space agency.
100% になりました。これで第2回のブーストが始まりました。またこれでしばらくずっと噴射状態が続くかと思います。
はい、時刻は0時5分を、0時6分ぐらいです。現在、スリムは第2回のブーストを開始しています。
So SLIM is going into the second phase of boost. So now you can see the engine firing.
緑色に表示されているかと思いますが、これ緑色になっているってことは、姿勢がもう姿勢の制御が想定通りになっていると、姿勢誤差が小さいということを表しています。赤い軌道も、赤のラインも白のラインと大体一致しているので、基準軌道に沿って進んでいるというふうに考えていいかと思います。
Now you can see the planned trajectory, and the red trajectory is going on the model. So this is going very close to the planned trajectory.
はい、少しずつ高度が下がってきています、ね。
そうですね。だいぶブレーキが効いてきましたね。最初軌道が先ほどお話しした理由で上がってたんですが、はい、もう落ちてきましたね。
It start to descend a little bit, as you can see on the right side. It's still doing the second boost.
ブーストを実施中です。
燃料酸化剤もだいぶ減ってきましたね。100キロもう割り込んできました。これ着陸しても全部途中でなくなるっていうわけではなくて少し残るような、
So we've been watching there Japan starting its precision landing of the Moon Sniper Slim spacecraft, and we're watching a graphic. It's not terribly exciting, the graphic. Let's bring in Jonathan Amos. It's a bit underwhelming as graphics go, Jonathan, but as far as we can see...
it's fascinating. No.
But as
It's
far as we can see,
utterly
it's
fascinating.
going well.
Let me just explain to you what we're looking at, right? Let me just explain to you what, on the left-hand side, we've got a sort of artist's impression of the lander itself. You see the orange bars? That's telling you which of the thrusters are firing. So there are 12 small thrusters and 2 very big thrusters on the bottom of this lander. If you look in the top right, you'll see the amount of propellant that they still have on board, which obviously they need to activate those thrusters. So we've got different colours. Sorry if you're colourblind, but there's blue, red, green and yellow. The one to watch in particular is the green, which is the total amount of propellant on board. That's dipped below 300 kilograms now, so that'll go down very close towards the bottom by the time they touch down. And then just below that you can see this arc with a little icon of the Slim lander tracing the arc at the moment. And so that is the model of what they hope to happen, they expect to happen, and the telemetry that they're receiving from the Sim lander at the moment coincides with their model, with their expectations. So about 3 GMT or midnight Japan Standard Time, they initiated the descent sequence. At that stage, the Slim lander was about 15 kilometers above the surface. It was traveling horizontally. It then, as it started this maneuver, series of maneuvers to get down to the surface, it rose slightly. But now you can see it is coming down towards the surface. And as it comes down towards the surface, it will be vertical. And the job then of this onboard mapping software that they have is obviously to pick the right location on the surface to put down, but also to avoid any large hazardous rocks, because if it touches a rock, a large rock, it's going to topple over, and that will be the end of the mission. So that's what you can see on this. It's not boring, Lauren. Come on, it's very informative and interesting.
I stand corrected.
Diagram.
I was being rude about the diagram. Now that I know all that detail, it's much more exciting. But they did say that it was following the planned trajectory and the model was going quite close to that, as you pointed out. And so when it gets there, with the two mini probes, I was reading one of them is described as kind of about the size of a microwave, and the other one is about the size of a baseball. And they'll take pictures.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
So talk us through what happens.
Yeah, they'll be
at that
chucked
point.
off just before they land. Yeah, they'll be chucked off just before the Slim lander puts down, and then they will kind of be independent. They'll take some pictures of the Slim lander, assuming it all gets down nice and safe. The first rover, if we can call it that, because it's like a hopper. It's got like a boot and a lever which will push it up and off the surface. That can contact direct with Earth. And the little one, this little transformer, baseball-sized thing, tennis ball-sized thing, which can change its shape, take pictures, that will communicate through the other rover. Just going to pick up on a point that Emma and Mickey were making about the importance of this mission. The other significant importance here is the fact that Japan is a key partner in the international team, which currently operates the International Space Station, but which, under NASA's leadership, is going back to the moon with people later this decade. So you may have heard of the Artemis program, the successor to Apollo. They're going to put people back on the surface of the moon for extended periods, not 2 or 3 days like they did with Apollo and then come home. They're going to go and they're going to stay. They're going to have a lunar space station. They'll go down to the surface for perhaps weeks on end, maybe build a base and all the rest of it. Japan will be a key part of that. They will bring to the table their technologies. And they will be needed. NASA needs them like it needs Europe, like it needs Canada, and anybody else that will participate. We've seen very recently the United Arab Emirates join this team as well, because they're going to build a part of the space station that goes around the moon. So, in America, in Canada, in Europe, they will be watching this very closely. They will want it to succeed, because that's all good news for the big Artemis program.
And remind us about that desire to go back to the moon. It's been an awfully long time, isn't it, since people have actually landed on the moon?
Yes, it's 1972 was Apollo 17. The last soft lander was 76, I seem to remember, which was a Soviet lander, and it wasn't then until 2013 when the Chinese went back with Chang'e 3. That we started to go back down to the surface. And again, I said earlier, depending on how you count it, there have been 9 or 10 efforts since the modern era started, if I can put it that way, with Chang'e 3, to touch down on the surface softly. And we've had 4 successes: Chang'e 3, 4, and 5, and Chandrayaan 3, which was the Indian mission. Fantastic at the South Pole. All the others have run into difficulty for one reason or another. It is very difficult. And so we're just hoping that Japan has the technology to make the odds go in their favor.
Jonathan Amos, thank you very much indeed for the time being. And we're just looking at what Jonathan was describing there is the feed from Japan of their attempts to land a spacecraft on the moon. And it would become the world's 5th country to achieve a moonshot, and it's an idea that would revitalise a space programme that's had a few setbacks in recent years. And JAXA, which is the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, said that the smart lander is at the moment on target. You're watching that trajectory there on the screen. That is linking to the planned trajectory that they had in mind. And if you've just joined us, viewers or listeners, just to remind you what we're seeing here, we're watching the feed from Japan of the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, JAXA. It's a smart lander for investigating the moon, SLIM, which is en route to the moon as we speak. Let's have a listen in to their feed.
はい、スリムは現在第3回のブーストを実施中です。スリムは第3回のブーストを実施中です。
そうですね。今、 VDM という文字が左側に、緑の文字に変わったと思いますが、
Now it's been changed
最後垂直降下モードに
VDM.
今入っているところです。
Now
これが
starting the
グラフの
vertical
セカン
descent.
ドラウンドに変わって2つの探査機が乗ってる。これ、X 方向から見たのと Y 方向から見たなんですかね、図になっています。で、X 方向というのは
And viewers joining in the UK, just to show you what we're looking at there, that is Japan, hoping to become the 5th country in the world to achieve a moon landing. This is its feed for its smart lander for investigating the moon, known as SLIM, which will aim to land on the moon in a very small area within 100 meters of its target. And it is then going to be investigating the potential sources of oxygen, fuel and water which might be sustaining life. Let's listen into that
パル
source.
スーン車ですね、今数字が 100%、メインエンジンのパーセンテージが 100% になったり、またそれ以外の数字になったりと切り替わってますが、これ、パルスーン車をしているので、こういった形で変化していると言ってみていいかと思います。で、これで500メーターぐらいのところまでこのまま降りていきます。で、500メーターのところで1回目のホバリングに入ります。
It will descend around 500 meter
スリムは現
and it will start
在
the first
垂直降下モードにて
hovering.
高度を下げております。スリムは垂直降下モードにて高度を下げております。1000メートル割り込みました。
そうですね。そろそろこれで500メートルなんで、ここで1回目のホバリングに入ると思います。しばらく高さを維持する状態になるかと思います。
Well, let's bring in our
Around
science
500
correspondent,
meter, it will
Jonathan Amos, who's
start to
monitoring this feed for us. So talk us through what we're seeing right now.
So they're about 500 meters from the surface of the moon. They'll use their big thrusters to do a hover maneuver over the surface of the moon. It's at that point that they will chuck out these two little rovers that they are carrying on board, and then they will gently, hopefully, go down to the surface. They'll kind of put 2 feet down, first of all, and then they'll swivel because they're going to land on something like a 15% slope. So they need to get the orientation correct so that they won't topple over or have problems later on the surface. They'll be in a good configuration. And if you look at the little coloured bars directly above the icon of the spacecraft, you'll see they're quite low now, the blue, the red and the green. We're down to just a few tens of kilos of propellant, both fuel and oxidizer. But they don't have far to go now. I think we're about, about 100 meters before we touch the surface. So fingers crossed, we will get there. Remember what is at stake here. We're talking about possibly the 5th nation to make a soft landing on the moon. Only the United States, the Soviet Union, China and India has achieved this before. So if Japan can do it, then that is a great feather in their cap and augurs well for the future of moon exploration, because at the end of this decade we're going back with humans led by the United States, but Japan will be a key partner in that exploration effort at the same time. So the commentator is telling us that we're hovering over the moon's surface at the moment, and in just a few moments, hopefully, we will touch down. First with those 2 feet, it's got 5 feet in total, but it needs to swivel around and make sure it's in the correct orientation on this slope next to this crater called Scioli, which is just south of the equator, Scioli crater. And then it looks good, I have to say, Lauren. Looks very, very good indeed.
And Jonathan, you talked about the importance of a soft landing. Explain to us why that's so critical.
On the left-hand side, M, that means
Because if you want to put supplies down on the surface, cargo, you want to put people down on the surface, you need to be able to, have we done it? All the thrusters are off. The model suggests we are on the surface, that we are down. There's no more, orange bars next to the spacecraft animation on the left-hand side.
Jonathan,
so that would
I think
suggest
it does sound from the space agencies put out a line saying they have landed on the moon.
from the telemetry.
So that's quite a moment, isn't it? Let's have a listen.
It is an extraordinary moment when you think how difficult this is.
You're listening to BBC News.
はい、テレメトリの画面上では、スリムは、月の表面に、到達したかと思われます。テレメトリの画面の上では、スリムは、月の表面に到達したかと思われます。
So we were listening in there just to see whether they were celebrating at all there for that moment where Japan has landed successfully a spacecraft on the moon. Jonathan Amos has been watching this with us. It seems that on the feed there wasn't anything that would tell us, particularly there, that they had actually done it.
The surface of the moon.
So, I mean, we can see from the graphic that they've been showing us that all of the thrusters are off. They're not using any more of the propellant as well. Now, have they got a telemetry glitch? Are they down and this is for real? It's on the surface and they're waiting for a confirmation signal from the spacecraft itself. You know, a sort of I'm here type of signal to come from the lander. But we're just sort of waiting for confirmation from JAXA that that is the case. Just going back to the private mission that was last year, it failed. The Japanese company iSpace, their lander thought it was at the surface. It got confused, its system for landing. It got confused about altitude, and it switched its engines off when it thought it was at the surface. In fact, it was still 5 kilometers above the surface, and then it crashed to the lunar surface. So they're not going to jump their guns here. They're going to make sure that they do have a confirmation signal from the SLIM lander.
Jonathan, for the time being, thank you. Let's bring in Dr. Emma Gatti, who's also been watching us this with us. Tell us what you make of what you've seen so far.
Lauren, I'm nervous because I'm waiting for confirmation too. Jonathan is completely right. We cannot jump to conclusions until the lander communicates back to Earth and tells us that it's not a hard landing. If it's a soft landing, is historical. They made it. But let's wait. Let's wait. I'm not seeing any signal. I'm checking the live on YouTube. The chat is exploding, definitely. The enthusiasm is high, but let's wait until they don't confirm. We cannot declare it a soft landing.
Yeah, so because it seems at the moment it's only really journalists who watched it land who are saying that it has landed. Whereas I thought we had it in a wire there just now from the Japanese Space Agency, but as we say, we'll try and clarify what they're saying at this stage. Tell us just briefly what your interpretation is of this moment. How big a moment is it in space history?
Well, as we said, landing is not easy. If they made it, it's historical for them in matter of prestige. It's important for Japan as a country. It's important for all the investment they made. They've been investing 20, 25 years on this, not only on this mission, but in general in the space sector. So this is a proof that it can be done, and it can be done by a country that is not as big as China or the US. This is important. Also, it's been said before by one of the other guests, the fact that if Japan has made, this is offering a proper alternative to China. Japan is, as Jonathan mentioned, part of the Artemis Accords, which is the entire mission, American-led mission about a focus on going back on the moon and building a permanent base on the moon. So Japan is part of the Artemis Accords. If they made it, they become suddenly one of the most important actors in the Artemis Accords. And because space is an extremely collaborative environment, you cannot go alone in space, you need partners. If the US, if Europe start to know that Japan made it, it means that Japan becomes a very interesting partner for everyone, for the Western world.
Now tell me, it's interesting, isn't it, that the collaboration you mentioned there, because geopolitically quite often countries that don't necessarily see eye to eye can still manage to collaborate on space issues. It's quite unusual, isn't it, in a way?
Well, Japan is not unusual because Japan is somehow somehow a Western democracy. This is not the correct definition, but it's a democracy, so it's an ally of the Western world. So collaboration between Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, and Japan are quite usual within the space sector. What becomes more delicate geopolitically is when we look at collaboration between the US and Russia, that of course now is completely suspended after the Ukrainian invasion, or between the US and China, where the collaboration is almost impossible. Before, Jonathan, I think, mentioned the United Arab Emirates. They are part of the Artemis Accords, which means that they are partnering with the US to go back on the moon, but they are also partners with China. So that's an interesting geopolitical situation. Japan instead is only an ally of the Western, of the US.
And just while we're talking, the confirmation of things are dropping on the wires, but it is still saying that JAXA Space Agency says the Japan moon probe, quote, appears to have landed. So that's a kind of highlight what you were saying and what Jonathan was saying, that actually at this stage we're not sure until you get some pictures and some information back.
Exactly, absolutely. We have to wait for a confirmation signal. I'm reading something in the chat. I don't want to take the chat as a final proof, so I will ignore the YouTube chat that I'm seeing.
Just remind us though, the little, so there's one gadget which is about the size of a microwave and one which is the size of a tennis ball or a baseball. Tell us what they'll be doing if it has indeed landed properly and those things have been deployed successfully.
I'm not sure about their technological purpose. So in that sense, I would prefer maybe someone more expert than me to give you an answer. What I can tell you is that the entire dimension of the lander is a small car. So we're speaking about a very small instrument that we sent on the moon. We're trying to make them smaller and smaller. So maybe about the use of the microwave part, I would just refer to someone more technologically wise, because I'm an isotope geochemist. So Lauren, I'm a bit like you. When I see the screen with all the engineering part, I get a bit fragile on that.
Okay, that's a good way of putting it, fragile. So Tom, but in terms of the significance, briefly, if you were, to sum this up, what would you say?
Well, if they land, this is 50% of what they wanted to achieve. If they landed where they wanted to land, that makes up to 70%. I would say the scientific missions in this moment is not the first goal. They are interested, as usual, in understanding the evolution of the moon. I saw before we connected, they were speaking with the geologists involved with the analysis, and they were speaking about understanding the structure of the moon when it comes to under the regolith. The regolith is the lunar soil, understanding better the mineral, the composition. Of course, understanding the moon means understanding the Earth, and understanding the moon and the Earth together means understanding the early stages of our solar system. So studying the evolution of the moon can give us an idea of where we come from, how we evolved, how the stars form, how the planets work, which is always interesting to understand our place within the universe, of course.
Dr. Emma Gatti, thank you very much indeed. You're watching BBC News.